All right, do you mind just putting the drawings up?
Yep. So I'll share what I did in preparation of this for this session. And what I was trying to do is show the connection of place where I live in. I live with a lot of trees around me, and I always feel a very strong connection to those trees. And I have all my life when I go walking, but also and hiking and snowshoeing, but also just living here where I live. I often tell people I negotiate the space that I live with the forest that's around me. And so with these drawings, I was trying to, based on what we talked about with Sechaba on Monday, I was trying to articulate that in the drawing. And then I found it really interesting to, as I was photographing the drawings, to frame them in different ways. So there's this one that shows more of the, the entire person. And then this one, and I really liked how this connection shows, and I like the element of how the foot and the tree, the base of the tree and the foot are talking to each other here, and then this foot kind of melts into roots.
Mm-hmm.
And so here with what I just magnified that a bit more with the, with the camera and framed it to capture sort of centering, like what Henry was talking about, having a focal point. So this point of connection then became, by reframing the drawing, I was able to kind of create that focus of connection between the tree and the person.
Mm.
And then this was another one I did sort of along with the same idea, but actually the person going through, morphing into this, this arm is a tree and this arm is an eagle's wing, because I have eagles living in the tree outside.
Mm.
And then based on, I was looking back at Sechaba's drawings again from his presentation, and I love the element of the hair in his drawings because it animated the drawing and again showed sort of a sense of movement. So I added the hair to the drawing, and we can see how it actually really transforms the drawing.
And gives it life and animation and movement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to comment on these, and then we can move on to the next one, or
I want to talk about all of them when you're done.
Okay. And so then, as I talked about on Monday, and I had said I wanted to try all of the things we looked at, and heard from Henry and David, and so I set up my drawing as David and Henry talked about, and here you can see I was testing my pencil leads to decide what pencils I wanted to use. I did the little thumbnail of the basic drawing I wanted to capture. And then I, reserved the space below. I was a bit scared to try to add the wings onto my tree. So I did a little sketch of it down there and worked out how I was going to do the wings. And I also switched from this drawing is entirely in different pencil leads. And then in this drawing, I added charcoal into the drawing, and I had in this drawing I had the elements of movement and the unseen, like we talked about in the lecture on Monday, by adding the clothesline and the clothes blowing in the wind, and also the person sitting here and the hair blowing in the wind, which is something I fight with all the time when I'm outside drawing. And so then I decided to transform this drawing into what Sechaba was talking about. And as I said, they're the eagles that have been in my trees all summer here and are still here, and which is an interesting advent of climate change, because they used to go down to the coast in the winter. And we're already seeing a change in that here. But to me, it gives me a tremendous sense of protection to know that, to have those eagles up there. And I don't always see them, but I often hear them. And I also have this it feels intimate relationship with them, because I hear them chattering with each other, but I also get these extraordinary views of them like washing down in the lake that's below me here, which you don't normally think of an eagle washing itself in the lake. So I feel like I have a very close relationship with the birds. And so I added these, and I intentionally sort of gave the wings a sense of wrapping around the space to reflect that kind of sense of protection. Mm-hmm. But then, interestingly, I went from the wings, and then I just started to play with the top, because I felt like it was still a bit, I don't know, there wasn't the sort of sense of animation in the tree that I was after. The sense of a presence there, a really active, I guess an active presence is what I wanted. And so then I moved on, I kept going, and I sort of chose to, you can see the difference also it made to just, darken the tree element in the background, and add some, I also didn't like this part of the drawing, so I added some, I just added the foliage to go higher up. But then I also started thinking about, like the feet and talons of the eagle, and just, decided to, and the connection to the ground. So to me, it kind of gave a stronger, even though this has roots, which like I drew in the other picture, I didn't draw here. This is like a different way of connecting to the ground. And then I started playing around with the top of the tree too, and just kind of letting my mind go. But actually it's kind of transformed to a raven. I feel like, instead of they also live here, instead of an eagle, with just the shape of the head, and the sort of abstracted beak, and so then, yeah, I just took I like this, because it brought the focus to, these different senses of movement, with the wing, with the clothes, with the hair, and it brought that into the focus of the drawing. I don't like that I lost the claw at the bottom, because I kind of like that element of the drawing, but then I found it really interesting to line them up here and see the progression, not only the progression of the drawing from the sense of just traditional drawing, but also how this drawing, it made me, really appreciate Sechaba's discussion in the class on Monday, because I feel like suddenly this drawing seems quite empty. It doesn't have this real sense of presence, of connection to the forest around me, and to the other creatures living in the forest, and that are a regular part of my life living here. And so and that I'm very conscious of, and absolutely have a relationship with. So that's sort of what I was, my process of what I went through with the drawing.
Yeah, so I think, there's something very important that I think you've achieved, because if somebody does the drawing on the left, yeah, how much has that person recognized the autonomy and the self-autonomy and agency of that space. How much are you the boss of that space, as opposed to that space being independent, autonomous, having inherent value without you even needing to be there. In other words, do you, from the first drawing, I mean, this is just it's a rhetorical question, does one from that first drawing immediately gain a kind of respect for that place, which is the same kind of respect that I would have when I meet you? Does that drawing make me feel like, oh, that place has its own desires, it has its own attitudes and its own proclivities? In other words, the place maybe is a bit moody, and sometimes it gets angry, and sometimes, it wakes up on the wrong side of the bed. So the what I'm getting when I look at what you've done, which is really classic for me, animistic kind of paradigm, is that you've almost revealed the actual spirit of the place. You've shown it, it's come up, it's revealed, let's rather say it's revealed itself to you. Because, without the presence that you're talking about, that ultimately appears on the far right, without that, you can easily want to dominate what's happening in that space on the left. You can easily feel like, oh, well, there's nothing here, or, this place doesn't have its own mind, therefore I can impose what I want on it. Whereas with what's on the right, you think twice. You're like, oh, there's a presence here. And there's actually something quite dangerous. It's not just, a little forest fairy. It's actually a powerful and dangerous, strong being. Like, when I look at the talents, I connect more with them in terms of them being dangerous. And that's true, that place is dangerous. And it has its own autonomy, and it has its own strength. So it's far more than just, it basically creates a situation where the drawing is almost like a ritual artifact or a ritual tool to make one see the presence of something in that place. And like I've told you, Kristen, when I think about totems, when I think about myths and stories of places, that's what they are supposed to do. They're supposed to basically reveal the presence of that place, so that I don't come in there without paying homage, without asking, without showing respect, without being conscientious of what I'm actually doing. I can't just do whatever I want, because I recognize that this thing has a soul, it has a spirit, it's an autonomous being. So what I'm seeing, what you've done, is it's almost as if it kind of started, it revealed itself from behind that tree. That spirit was there all the time, and suddenly you allowed yourself to recognize it, and it kind of just appeared from behind that tree.
And I'm finding it just really interesting, Sechaba, to hear to sit here and look at the drawing and listen to you and think about how, like in my mind, I had, as I said before, I had the eagle in my mind as I started to draw the wings, and but then it was very unintentional that the top is more like an abstracted raven, or crow, both of whom live in this forest. And it was almost like them wanting their presence to be known, and also the idea of the presence of the trickster in the indigenous storytelling of this region and many regions, and also to think about it suddenly as you were talking, and sort of the different meaning that you brought to the claws at the base of the tree. It came into my mind that also it gives a sense of agency to the other creatures living in the forest, of them protecting that tree, because that tree is actually their home. Because in a sense, what I've shown is the place where I live, but the place where they live as well. And that tree is where they live. That's their home. So I haven't just drawn one home here. And so it's so interesting to sort of start to have a conversation and think about how many different things this brings up. Like in the descriptions of the sketching school, we talked about, like detail. What details do we want to show in a drawing? And what information versus detail versus information, and what it is we're trying to show with a drawing. And I think that this has brought a whole different, conversation of information to the drawing that then is now being reflected in our conversation, because we wouldn't have had this conversation if I had only done that.
Exactly.
It doesn't, yeah.
So can we just look at the one slightly above the, the ones on the right above the character? Yeah. If
This
you
one,
zoom in.
this one here?
On the right. Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you see here, what for me is really important is that, that's why I was saying that we can use figures to represent places, right? So here for me, what you've done is you've now made, like for example, the character of the snake in the Myths from Home.
Yeah.
Remember I talked about how the whirlwind and the snake are seen as one thing, and the whirlwind is obviously a natural phenomena, but it has a particular kind of character. And I mean, even if you read phenomenologists, like there's something that Merleau-Ponty wrote about water. And, he described water as being almost insanely obsessive about getting to the bottom of things. So, water always wants to rush down because of gravity to the bottom of something and to like find this equilibrium. It kind of has almost like a franticness about it that it wants to. I mean, that's one way of describing it, right? But you see, by doing that, he's not describing water as an element like H2O or whatever. He's not fragmenting it or breaking it down. He's describing it in terms of its characteristics. And here what you've done in a similar way for me is by doing a drawing like of this figure. I'm not seeing the figure as a figure standing in a forest. I'm seeing the figure as the forest.
Yeah.
The figure is the forest.
Exactly.
And you've obviously articulated certain things by it being feminine, because for me, it looks feminine. Again, it looks like, a strong character, and it has presence. So, if an architect or anyone comes into a space and does a drawing of that place, they draw the hills and the what and the what, do they leave there having encountered the spirit of the place or the being in such a way that, they have avenues to dialogue and to communicate with that place? Because you need to be able to, human beings, unfortunately, we anthropomorphize everything in order for us to be able to relate with things, you know. It kind of, we know how to relate to persons. And so if you don't articulate it as a person, then how do you even begin to relate to it? You know, if you say relate to the mountain, yes, you can climb the mountain, you can walk on the mountain, you know, and you can sense, you know, you can begin to sense its characteristics. The moment you think of the mountain as Ubaba, you know, Father Mountain,
Yeah.
suddenly, you know, you're drawing something into your own self. You're bringing something into yourself, which allows opening into an avenue of some sort of dialogue between yourself and that being. So yeah, and that's why indigenous communities, at least the ones from home, become very disturbed when people treat these other beings in negative ways, because, you know, for them it's not just a river or a swamp or a lagoon. And to be able to engage it as a person is the only avenue, or at least the avenue I've seen from wisdom from indigenous communities. That's how people find ways to communicate.
I want to grab something quickly to share. This is a very small cutting of, but I was part of what's reflected in this drawing is a couple of years ago, I was part of a play that Rosalind Williams, who's one of the knowledge keepers and an extraordinary elder in this Blatchine band, and she's written and shared and produced 5 plays, I believe now, and they're community activist plays. So they're all specifically around issues and they're that the community is facing. And to her, it's sort of a contemporary articulation of the storytelling tradition. And so I don't know how well you'll be able to see this, but the play was called Swetia's Quest, which means in the Secwepemctsín language, what is your name? And what the play was about was the fact that all of the places here were renamed by the colonizers. And what she was communicating, and we spent 6 months learning, the entire play was sung, and we spent 6 months together, 4 evenings a week, having meals together and learning the language of the songs so that we could all sing the songs for the play. And what you're talking about is exactly what she was doing with this play, is articulating the loss of that connection that you're talking about with the loss of the names, because they aren't just names. Exactly. The name reflects the relationship and the history of the people, of the relationship between the people and that mountain or that forest or that cliff or that river or that, you know, I said to her after we did the play, I was riding my mountain bike and I stopped and I realized through the course of that play, my relationship with how I am in the landscape had changed. Because I was much more aware and felt the presence of the other elements besides myself. I think as human beings, we have a tendency to, we take up so much space in the space we're in that we forget there are other things that are living and sentient in that landscape with us, because we've largely been trained to, think of them as objects. And so, it really struck me that day. And I actually went and talked with her about it, that, the extent to which my relationship with the land that I was in had changed. And I think that was part of this drawing. You know, this is sort of an autobiographical drawing. So
yeah, I mean, people, you know, they kind of look down on terms like Mother Nature, you know, just the sort of connotations when somebody says something like Mother Nature. But do you mind just going to the drawings that you put, that I did, that you put here on Miro? There's a specific one that I just want to show, which is quite similar to what you've got here. And, you know, she also happens to be a female. Yeah. So, oh, okay, it's not actually in these ones, but okay, yeah, I guess you could go to the one there of the running on the top right.
yeah, I know exactly the drawing that you mean, I think. And actually, I have your presentation here on the Miro board, because isn't she in the?
Yes, it is in the presentation.
In fact, is this the one you were thinking of?
No, there's another one.
Which
the ones with the three figures stand it's on one page, there are like three figures.
this is a really cool feature of Miro board, that you can put the presentations on here and you can actually click through them right on the Miro board without having to download them or anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this one. So if you just go to the picture, the image on the left, far left.
This one?
Yeah. So basically what I was trying to depict here was the cosmos, you know, and the aim was that inside here, this black spot, that's actually, you know, the cosmos, and those are galaxies. And the whole point is that, you know, she is a being, you know, she is a being, and there's some kind of a way in which one needs to relate with her. And obviously, you know, this big black cosmos with all the galaxies inside, it's basically saying she's pregnant, right? She's pregnant with all that exists. And, you know, I think the reason why people used to talk like that is because it's just very hard to have a relationship with things. You know, to have a real relationship with things. If something is a thing, it's just a dead object. It's just very hard to have a relationship with it. And you actually end up just treating it like a thing. And that's what I was saying about decolonization at the beginning of my presentation, was the objective, if we want to talk about decolonization in drawing, it has to undo what colonialism did to many people and lands, which was to turn them into things, to turn them into objects. And, you know, obviously, if you turn something into an object, you subjugate it, you abuse it, you turn it into a commodity, you basically turn it into an object of capitalism, because you've made it lose its personhood. So the whole aim for me of decolonization is giving what we used to call things, giving them their personhood back. You know, and I know, like in Australia, I've spoken to people who told me about, you know, this phenomenon of communities giving human rights to rivers. And that's basically where we need to go, because, you know, the reason you're giving human rights to a river is because that river is just as important as your lung, or as important as your spinal cord in terms of your survival, right? So you're actually extending what you would call human rights out to everything else, because everything else is part of what makes us human. Without them, Without all those other beings in the world, we die. We can't survive.
It's interesting that you brought that up about the humanizing, because I think this is such an important conversation around the relationship we have to the land, to whether that's a natural land, like what I've shown in my drawings largely, or in a more urban land. We have at AU, we have what's called a program called Naskatoan, which is a gathering space. It's where the university's resident elder leads that, and earlier this year, or I guess last year, they had this really interesting series of conversations where they invited elders from different First Nations cultures across Canada, and that specific topic of giving legal rights to the rivers, and it was New Zealand was the first country that's done that, and it was interesting to hear the discussion that went on between the elders about that, and not about what you're saying that's what we need to do, because that was agreed upon, but the notion of giving it legal rights within the what in both New Zealand and here are colonial legal systems, and how that relationship works with colonization and decolonization processes, because one of the elders made the point that he said he was absolutely against that legalization, not because of the rights that you talk about don't need to be treated as important as our human rights, as if, as you say, it's like that river is our lung, which, in reality, if we look at the relationships deeply enough, it is. But the fact that he didn't like the idea that has to be legitimized by the Western legal system, which I had never thought about it that way, because I thought it was so I read about that. Sorry, what's that?
Sorry, because it's also problematic that
absolutely it is. Yeah, absolutely it is. And I just hadn't thought deeply enough about it in my initial excitement of, wow, how great is this that we're giving a river that right, because the reality is it allows tremendous protections to it. But then, it also is just digging us deeper into, in some senses, into this colonized way in which we relate to the world. So it was for me, it was a really critical thing to hear,
Yeah. I think I would agree with that, because I do know that, how, I can't imagine how land rights from a Western legal perspective how would they work in a situation where the land is autonomous and has its own rights? Like, how does the property laws and all of that, how does that even work? How can you call it your own property, etc.? And I know that this might sound very idealistic and naive, but yeah, unfortunately, one can be called naive and idealistic as much as anyone wants, but we can see what the consequences of treating every other being in this world as a thing. We know what the consequences are. We can see them. We are seeing them now because we just didn't have that respect. And so anyone who wants to use the kind of, oh, you're not being rational, mountains are not alive, why would you think it's a being, why give it a name, why give it personhood? You can argue that as much as you want, the kind of materialism argument, rationalist argument, But, you know, unfortunately, human beings have certain behavioral patterns. You know, the moment you say to somebody, and that's why, you know, that's the same logic behind war and violence. The moment you say, ah, those ones, they're not people, and they're also not like us.
Yeah.
That's immediately how you can basically, you know, kill and plunder others. And that's exactly what has happened with all other beings in the world. We've basically been at war with them because we've seen them as others, and they're not even alive. It doesn't actually matter what we do to them, you know, and we know the consequences. So we have to find ways, new ways that are inspired by tradition and old ways, new ways of talking about places, representing places, articulating. That's what this whole project is about. Because if we keep doing it the old way, I mean, if we do drawings of a place, you know, the way we've always done drawings of a place, you know, what's going to change? Because we've been doing this for a long time, doing drawings of places the way we've been doing them, these sort of picturesque, kind of almost romantic images. We've been doing that for centuries. But how has that made people any more loving and caring towards places?
Yeah.
Compared to those communities and the times in humanity when they used to infer personhood in places. You know, how does a beautiful sketch of, you know, a Grecian temple make you truly recognize the autonomy of that land and that you should enter it with respect? How does that really deepen that? And in fact, the thing about this drawing, you can see that I didn't make these figures pretty, and that was deliberate.
Yeah.
I didn't make them pretty because if you make them pretty, you know, you make it seem as if, it's not a dangerous thing, or, oh, you know, Mother Nature, she's just so fertile and pretty and beautiful. Again, it's just another way of trying to subjugate and control. That's why they're not pretty. That's why you can't see her face, because that's not what this is about. Yes, she's fertile and she's a woman because she's got this whatever, but you know, that's not what defines a woman. That's not. Here, what we're talking about is something that is strange and powerful and dangerous, and that you need to respect. But it's at the same time something that is nurturing, that has brought you the air in your lungs, and that has given you the blood cells that course through your veins so that you can actually produce oxygen at the same time, simultaneously.
And I think for me, as I look at them, one of the things it begins to do too, is it sort of decentralizes the human. I think that's something that we, as humans, and it's so interesting how it's so woven into the narratives of our value systems, of the importance of the human being, and how, you know, in many narratives, everything else that's out there has been put there in order for our benefit. You know, it's there to feed us. It's there to, you know, take care of our needs, and I think that this begins to sort of challenge that concept of making ourselves the importance of the spaces that we're in.
Yeah. So yeah, I think, you know, what I would love to see more and more is, and it's easy, you know, that's why I say, even just doing figures, you can do a figure of a place, you know, and it's not for other people out there, it's for you. You know, when you do a figure of a place, you are creating an opportunity for yourself to begin to commune, engage, relate with that place. And, you know, when you draw that figure and something happens to you in that place, you know, you sort of fall and maybe sprain your ankle or whatever, you should think about that figure and be like, yes, damn it, he's such a mean bastard. Because that's also true, you know. I mean, look at what's happened with COVID and look at what's happening with climate change. It's not just a friendly, pretty, you know, damsel, Mother Nature, you know. So when you draw that figure, it really helps to begin to articulate and for you to have a way of engaging and communing with that. I mean, maybe one day we'll have architects, you know, include that in their practice when they visit site, drawing the figure that represents the site. And maybe they give that to the client and say, this is actually who you're staying in. I have communicated, I'm the shaman here. I'm the communicator of places as the architect. And I've communicated and I've seen this place has revealed itself to me. This is who you're dealing with. And just watch out because, you know, he or she sometimes stings.
I think that's such an interesting thing. Two things that you've just said I found, you know, particularly interesting in relationship to the conversations we've been having, you know, as we reimagined this sketching, not just the sketching school, but the sort of role of drawing and in architecture, and given the things that we're facing right now, and in the sort of bigger question of what role does architecture have in addressing climate change, and one of them is that you said that the drawing isn't for somebody else. It's for the process of what you go through. And I think that's so important because we're so taught to think of, you know, well, what's someone else going to think of this drawing? I have to create a beautiful drawing so that people like it, you know? And instead of like, what is it that, and that's something I so learned with the drawing that I shared that I did, is just when I let go of that and just started, you know.
Can we go back to it, please?
Just started playing around with what happens when I just start, you know, actually drawing, the physicality of actually drawing these kind of things that we've been talking about. But and then the second thing is that, you know, just here in British Columbia where I am, this year we've had temperatures of 50 degrees, which is the hottest Celsius, which is the hottest temperature ever recorded above the 49th parallel. We've had a city that within 15 minutes from the start of the fire burned to the ground, just gone. We've had the 50-degree temperature was part of the new phenomenon, climatic phenomenon called a heat dome, and that lasted about 5 days. It was broken with an electrical storm that, and 700,000 lightning strikes were recorded in our, and there's this amazing imagery of it recorded in our province. And that ignited forest fires all over the province. We had the worst forest fire season in history. We then had an atmospheric river, which is another new climatic phenomenon that's ranked like hurricanes. And we had the highest rated atmospheric river that the scientists had come up with, that we, you know, that they thought possible, which caused massive mudslides, partly because the forest had burned off, which completely cut off all of our rail and road transport to the coast. And it's like, how do you even, and then I asked myself the question of how can people not just believing in climate change, but acting on it. But when you see these huge things, you feel kind of and I've read the psychology around it. And as human beings, if we're faced with these gigantic traumatic events, we just shut down and we don't, it's a protection mechanism in our brain.
Mm.
But actually doing drawings like this, where you begin to actually articulate the relationships of your own self to the landscape, I think it becomes a way to start to actually access those bigger questions that maybe we couldn't access before because they seemed so overwhelming. But now it's just me and the tree and the eagle and the raven and the wind and the house and how, how are those relationships actually going to work, and how do I include them all in the practice of architecture? And so I think that's quite a profound thing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, as you were talking, I was just thinking, actually, big events like, for example, I mean, yes, climate change is probably more subtle, but something like forest fires and volcanoes. Many people in the past have given names to these phenomena, and they give names and characteristics to them. And like in the past, people would even like sacrifice and do all kinds of things. And the whole thing about sacrificing was, it was a petition to a being that was perceived to have some kind of sentience. And I mean, today I wouldn't I wouldn't sacrifice to a river or whatever, right? If you want to do that, you can. But what I think we can learn from that is that people were trying to find ways of engaging. They were trying to find ways of engaging and of relating and communing somehow, and of sensing something, the presence of something. So, by drawing it, by creating figures, by creating narratives and stories, you then give it presence, and you have some way. I mean, if you say something doesn't have personhood or being, how are you going to, engage it other than in your own egoistic terms? Like a mug, what do you do with a mug? You take the mug, you drink it, you drink from it, and you kind of control it, you bully it around, you push it around, you do whatever, right? You might protect it because, if it's not around, it will inconvenience you, so the mug is important as far as it is about pleasing your own desires, because you see it as a thing. But when you're dealing with a volcano or with a river or something like that, and you begin to articulate it as a thing, and you want to treat it the same way you treat your mug, pushing it around, with your dams and whatever, and trying to, redirect it and all of that stuff, that's why we end up having the issues that we're having today. So I think even big things, massive kind of natural disasters, so-called natural disasters, etc., or phenomena, people in the past had ways of articulating even that to that level of, I mean, even the climate, people had ways of articulating and engaging that, even seasons. I mean, a season is such a subtle and long-term phenomena, yet people still had ways of engaging. The cosmos in its totality is so huge and subtle, yet people had ways of communing. So I think, even though we might feel like, oh, climate change is just so subtle and it's so slow and, it's so broad, people can't immediately sense it. I think that's just because we've forgotten the kind of tools that we had in the past that allowed us to do that no matter what the scale is.
Well, and it's so interesting you say that, because in, hurricanes, which have been tracked for ages, and they're quite interesting. You can, for example, look them up on the NASA website, and you can see images of how they move across large bodies of water and change, and they have always been named. Like they're officially given a name, every significant hurricane that comes through. And I just did a quick search on the internet as you were talking to see if atmospheric rivers, if they're being named, because we've had one here. There was one in the east. There was one down in California. I'm sure there are many others around. Those are just, regionally the ones I know. And but when I just did a search there, interestingly, there doesn't seem to be a they haven't created names around them, because that is a really interesting point of, it shifts the relationship we feel with them when they have a name, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that people often talk about how Inuits have X amount of names for water, what. But I think what would even be more powerful is if we started naming atoms and molecules, and naming different things on the periodic table, instead of calling them H2O. I mean, I know it's hydrogen to oxygen, but giving them names, all the things that are in science, giving them names from different languages, and really recognizing that even at these smallest elements, these are not just things. They're not just things. They're not just, lifeless things. They are part of what makes life, So I think it's like such a lot of work that we can do as far as that's concerned.
Well, and it's so interesting to in one of the questions in both the description and in my introduction to the sketching school was around the notion of a rock, and how, in the West, we tend to look at a rock and, and think of it as an object. It's something I might think to sit on as I'm drawing. And then I was having a conversation with David Fortin, who is a member of the Ontario Métis, and who gave an amazing lecture on land and the relationship to land and the colonization of land in our global studio in December. And in one of the conversations he and I had before the lecture, he was relating that he was speaking with an elder who said to him that she couldn't drive down a certain road anymore because they were blasting it to do some construction. They were blasting the landscape, and the rocks were screaming so loud she couldn't stand to be in that space. And then I'm reading this. I just finished this wonderful book, and it's written by Tyson Yunkaporta, who is of the Apalak clan in northern Queensland in Australia, and he talks about rocks as knowledge keepers. And and I thought, wow, what an interesting way to refer to them, because I mean, in a sense, that's how I've been trained to think of them, in the sense that I've been trained to think of them as they, for example, depending on what kind of rock they are, they either have sedimentary layers, and that we learned all about in school, and those layers are from different periods of time, or they have, or certain types of rocks hold and capture fossils that we now, tell us the story of different. So I was in fact being taught that these rocks are knowledge keepers, but it was never presented that they were, he presents them as active sentient beings in the landscape, and like talks about the fact that, you shouldn't just without any thought pick up a rock and move it, because you're changing that rock's you're changing its story, you're changing its landscape, you're changing, but going back to what David Fortin was relating as well, you know, I have a similar experience here. They're blasting our highway that goes across the country. They're blasting a big cliff space. And I've known that landscape my entire life. And now they're drastically changing it. And I find it painful to drive down that road. But I'd never thought of it in the sense of, it was always about me, you know, it was always about me. I didn't like it because it's changing the landscape, I know. And like going back to what you were saying about, you know, is it enough to just draw beautiful pictures? Because, and this happens to be the picture that's in my mind of that landscape that's now being changed. But to then take this further to give the rock face a being. And I actually sent him a note thanking him for sharing that story with me, because I felt like, wow, I finally actually have a way to articulate those emotions that I have as I go by those, and I have a place to put those that actually has more meaning. The same as when I said to you, when you said, showed me the pictures and then you shared them in the sketching school, of including the snake as context to the beings that are in, and the forces and so on that are actually in a space that we often don't show. The same thing, you know, I think I shared with you, you know, that it suddenly gave me a way to do a drawing that I from a very, very difficult period of my time that includes domestic violence, that I had no way to show the relationship of those evil forces and that building, because there is, as architects, that's important that we're able to articulate those kind of relationships. Because among other things, you know, could that inform the way we design buildings? You know, I was teaching at WITS actually, and in the housing master's program, so not all the students were architects. And I said to them, okay, let's just do it. I want you as a quick, 5-minute sketch of what you think is important to include in this was for, you know, low income housing. And after they got beyond the, you know, I can't draw a house, it was fascinating because the things that women put in the drawing and the things that men put in the drawing, in every single drawing, though, it was different. And yet we live in spaces that are predominant, that have historically and to, you know, continue in most places to be designed and built by men. And so, you know, I think that the beautiful thing about what we're talking about today is it opens up such a bigger conversation about what is architecture and how these kind of drawings can inform what we do.
I mean, you know, if you do a drawing of a site and, you know that, you know, so say, for example, you do a nice picturesque drawing of some place. But then when you go find out a little bit more about that place, you find out that, you know, a particular building there was used as a Nazi concentration camp. And that lots of things have happened in that space. You know, are you telling me that, and you can kind of see the outcomes of that in that community, you know, say, for instance, somewhere in Berlin or whatever, you can see that you can kind of tell what the outcomes, or maybe you can sense that something has happened here, and the presence of whatever had happened those many years ago is still present. You know, if you just did a picturesque drawing, how are you going to get to that? And when you're now designing, you know, is it not possible for you to miss, you know, the kind of thing that you need to respond to? Because you haven't actually engaged, you know, the kind of things that have happened there. Because if I did a drawing of a piece of the Berlin Wall, and I just kind of did the drawing, you know, I don't know whether for me as a person drawing it, it will do enough for me to connect with whatever may have happened there so that I can respond appropriately, you know. And similarly with a piece of land, if I just do a drawing of the trees and whatever, I don't know if that's enough for me to be able to respect that land, you know, respect it enough so that I can actually do what's appropriate in that place. So I think, yeah, I mean, this is what I'm talking about, right? These kind of matter-of-fact drawings. So if we don't engage in these experiments and try these new things, you know, and I mean, the question is, why are we not doing that? Why are we not experimenting and trying new things and breaking tradition? Because, you know, we've done what we thought we ought to do for all these years, and look where we've ended up. Surely we need to start doing things slightly differently, you know.
Well, and it's what you're talking about brings to mind as well. I talk with my students all the time about the colonial language in many of the cities and towns across Canada, and how, you know, and the difference of lived experience that language creates for people. Like for me as a white settler, it's very different than for somebody from, you know, the Splashing Band, for example, here, who encounters that architecture and the level of, or people in Johannesburg, who friends there, and conversations I've had with them about, you know, how the sense of whether you feel that you can even go in that space, whether you're, you know, whether you're even represented as part of what is called Canada now. Are you even part of that? And and now as you're talking, I'm thinking, wow, wouldn't it be such an interesting exercise to have students not just go and look, because almost anywhere you are, you can go and find that kind of colonial language, and in this country, but to actually then draw the kinds of things we've been talking about in this discussion, overlay that, you know, that colonial language with the types of things that we're talking about. And I think that would be a really quite eye-opening experience for most students.
I mean, the union buildings in Johannesburg, in Pretoria, in South Africa, is the spirit of the forest welcome there, you know? And if it is welcome, or of the river, I mean, they've got a river in Pretoria which is always so polluted. I can't recall the name now, but every year when you'll find an architecture master student from Pretoria lamenting about the situation of that river. Yet when you drive around, the kind of urban layout has muted that river so drastically, you can barely sense that it has presence, you know. I mean, for me, that would immediately say, how can we make it present again? How can we make it visible again? You know, when we do drawings, when we talk about it, when we have community narratives, stories, how do we make it visible again? You know, and that's, otherwise, you know, you can't expect a community to suddenly love something or value something if it's invisible to them. And if it's just a thing, you know, no way.
Well, and I think that gets into also the responsibility that we have as educators. I've had, you know, I've had many students write me notes at the end of the course saying they've completely changed the way they look at the landscape, at the city, because these things were never, you know, these things these relationships, these issues of equity, of justice, of that are present in everywhere where all of us live. And yet that's not often an overt part of what we're teaching and what people are learning, and the narratives that are told, whether they're national narratives or historical narratives, or and so I think it's, you know, I think it's something that we as educators really really need to push, how, you know, we can how we can get students to see more of what's in the landscape.
Can just the last point that I want to make, Kristen, could we just go to the slide that has the Brooks slave ship on it?
Yeah, I think it's the one just after this.
Yeah, so could you zoom in on the ship, please? Just so that we can see those figures. Yeah. So could you just zoom out a bit just so that we can see them in the context of the ship?
Yeah.
Yeah. So ultimately, you know, if we continue drawing the way we're doing it, we end up with this, right? And, you know, I know someone could argue, well, it's not the drawing style or technique that created this, it's the people behind it, right? But I argue that, you know, having this matter of fact, objectivist approach can lead to things like this, because, you know, like I said, if you see people as things, as objects, it's okay for you to store them in the bottom of a ship packed like this, because they are like, you know, how we pack goods in a freight ship or whatever, you know, in a container, and we ship it to whatever, your cell phones and whatever. This is basically what's happening here. And the last point that I want to make related to this is that the big risk of treating other people and other creatures in this world and, you know, land and etc. in this way is that what you're actually doing is you're giving yourself, your own soul, you're telling yourself that it is possible that I'm also just a thing. You know, if you live in a world where other things are things, then you are planting in your own soul the possibility that in actual fact, whatever, I'm also just a thing.
Yeah.
And you see, by doing that, what you ultimately do immediately is you rob yourself of your humanity.
Yeah.
You take away every ounce of value within yourself, because in fact, just like, you know, these people here who, you know, in essence are just things, can be chucked into the ship, whether 50 of them die by the time we get there, it doesn't matter. It's a bit of a loss, you know, in our account books, we'll get by doing that, you're presenting that as a possibility for yourself. And you so you know, when we do the opposite, when we infer personhood, when we give life to others, we are doing the same to ourselves. It's immediately reflected towards ourselves. So you can see that in many communities now, particularly in the West, we have a lot of suicide and depression and all sorts of things like that. You know, for me, that's when life becomes meaningless.
Yeah.
And when life becomes meaningless, we basically descend into a big black void, you know, a bottomless, empty, nihilistic void. And that's really the threat here, and that's what's at stake. So yeah, I think that's really the last thing I want to say. And when we look at drawings like this, that's what we ought to sense. We need to see that what we're actually looking at here is a nihilistic, very threatening image to our humanity. And something like this has to terrify us, because we are basically, pulling the rug under all that is meaningful in humanity with something like this.
I think I'll just quickly respond with two things. I think this last point you've made is so powerful, not only in the context of this sketching school, but also in the context of the much larger discussion of why it matters that we decolonize our education, our spaces, our way of relating to other people, to the land, because so often the response is one of by white settlers is that the fear of loss, the fear of change, the fear of loss, that people will have less, that people will, all of those fear triggering responses, when in fact it's actually, for me, it's actually, to me, it's actually about the fact of how much we will all gain by going through this what will, which is sometimes a hard process, sometimes a joyful process, sometimes a very difficult process, is that we will all gain from that for the reason that you've just talked about. It's about our humanity and the loss of our humanity, because and I think it's sort of really important to situate what we're doing in all of that and really think about that. But also and then the other point I wanted to make, just in response quickly too, is I'm so glad that I have seen this drawing, unfortunately, many times before, but I'm so glad that you brought it into this discussion, and that and that we've really looked at it further today. And because, like when we talk about details, going back to what is important about sketching and what's important about this sketching school and details, and that, David and Henry and Joanna, who will be joining us in a couple of weeks, have brought up. And to me, one of the most disturbing things about this drawing is this detail right here in the bow of the ship, where not only, this is, it goes without saying, it's so incredibly, the whole thing is so incredibly disturbing, but lining people up and spacing them. But this, to think, okay, we have this awkward space here, but look, we can put one pair of people here, one pair of people here, one pair of people, but if we really squeeze them, we can actually even fit this one lone guy in right here. And the thought that implies of how these are just crates. Yeah. It's like, that's how I pack my car, when I put crates, when I put luggage or something. I think, oh, if I shove this a little bit, then I can fit one last thing in. And that, to me, this tells that story. And I find that so incredibly disturbing.
Exactly. But that's why when I started my talk, I said, I'm following on Fanon and identifying the pathology of colonialism.
Yes.
And, and how to undo that. And for me, it's about giving back personhood to those whose personhood was stripped. And exactly, that guy is just a piece of luggage. Like I said, he's just, part of what's being exported, like we export goods, and they needed to maximize on the real estate of that space.
Yeah.
You know, and that's exactly it. And that's as far as the thought behind that went.
I also just wanted to say, I was so glad that you put these, and this is why, you know, with my students, I'm always at them to use more images, and why I think it's so important as architects that we use images and bring images into what we do, because we need to see things, and we need to make, we need to understand the relationships of what we're doing, that sometimes we aren't even conscious of what we're doing. And I found this so revealing, to put these two next to each other. And in a sense, I mean, it goes back to what we were just talking about with humanity as well, because the reality is we can look at a lot of contemporary subdivisions that we're designing now, and it looks, if you look at it at the right scale, it looks just exactly like this. And so we're doing this same thing here. We're the slaves to capitalism, to what we've been talking about earlier of the you know, of what happens when you commodify land and ways of life and so on, is that, you know, this you know, this kind of use of land to maximize the number of houses, which is, let's be real, that's how most of subdivisions are designed. For me, it awakens this very clear message of, you know, making the parallel to this, to, you know, the relationship that we now have to capitalism, and how, you know, what can be learned from putting these drawings side by side.
Yeah, basically being numbers, numerical.
Yeah.
Yeah, according to Newford.
Yeah, and we could look at prison, you know, plans, and make the same kind of parallels. And you know, I think it's, yeah, it's so valuable to you know, have these really what you know, in many ways come down to relational conversations around what we do as architects.
All right, I think that should be it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sechaba.
Cool.
And I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to turn off the recording now.